Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Remember to subscribe to our free podcast so you won't miss any of our illuminating content. Here is episode 177.
Do something to make your marriage better, because marriage holds our society together.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Blaine Rindlisbacher. Since rescuing his own marriage, Blaine has become intensely passionate about what makes successful marriages work. These insights have driven him to study marital principles in the classics, complete with a master's degree in marriage and family therapy through Liberty University, and finally to be the founder of Adore Your Spouse, and make 12 principles of happy marriages available to others so that you can learn to adore your spouse. Welcome, Blaine.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so
excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have Blaine here too. I've been wanting to have him on almost from the beginning of my podcast because I was so intrigued with those 12 principles of, adoring our spouse. But before we get into more about your work and your mission of creating a happy marriage, why don't you go ahead and start off by telling our audience a little bit more about yourself?
I've been married happily for almost a little over 23 years. My wife has been happily married to me for about 7 years.
Oh, boy.
That's kind of a joke, but it's kind of true, unfortunately. We have 6 awesome children, and our oldest just got married last week. And so now we have 7 awesome children. And
Sweet.
I sold real estate for years and years and years because that's kind of the family business. My dad's been very, very successful in real estate development, and I got my real estate license and started selling and didn't think much, but found myself not being very happy. And finally, after about 10 years of marriage, I was starting to talk about doing something else. It took me another 5 years to finally give myself permission, and then I got my marriage and family therapy degree now from Liberty University, and I just love saving marriages.
That's awesome. Well, do you want to give us a little background into your journey? It sounds like you went from real estate into this sort of thing, but give us the background of what that journey looked like that led you to discover what you love to do now.
Well, it's really funny because probably the first big insight we had, well, I guess it goes back to real estate. I used to go on listing appointments. That's where sellers would have me over, and they would interview me to see if they wanted to hire me to sell their home. And I'd come home and I'd said to my wife, made another one cry. And what I meant by that is when I was in the appointment, I'm very intuitive. And so I can pick up on things that are happening. And a lot of guys aren't intuitive, but I would pick up on what the wife was feeling and I'd make a comment. I thought, boy, this is hard, isn't it? And she just started bawling because she was looking for that and her husband couldn't see that or whatever. But it happened over and over again. We just laughed because I was kind of a counselor, quasi-counselor / real estate agent. And then I'll never forget that probably about 8 years ago, my brother and sister-in-law told me that their neighbors were getting divorced, and I was distraught. I didn't even know who they were. I'd seen them, but I didn't even know their names. And I kept kind of pacing the floor at home, and I kept saying, Audrey, you think it'd be okay if I went over there and talked to them? I didn't even know what I was going to say at the time, but I just so desperately wanted to save their marriage. I hadn't discovered the 12 principles at this point or that point. I just wanted to save their marriage. And it was really funny. And my wife's like, I think you probably should get into marriage therapy. But it took a long time. It's funny because when we love to do something and it's really our passion and our mission, our purpose in life, it's hard to give ourselves permission to do it. And I think it's because we're scared to screw it up. It's so sacred to us. It's so absolutely critically important to us that whatever this thing is that we feel so passionate about, that we don't want to mess up. But I think that's me. I was scared. I didn't want to make things worse. I didn't want to say the wrong thing and hurt the marriage worse. Even though I'd heard stories from other therapists that were ridiculous, I still didn't want to do that. So it took myself quite a few years to give myself permission to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And sadly, part of it was I made good money in real estate. So, and I kept thinking, well, God, I can get a job and they're going to pay me less than half of what I'm making. And then eventually it finally clicked, oh, I can own my own business. I can own my own clinic, and I can make a lot more money than just, a regular therapist. And that's kind of when I was like, okay, full steam ahead.
Do you kind of want to go into that? You, in the kind of the beginning, you said that you were married, for 23 years and she's been happily married for 6. Is that kind of, and in the intro, we talked about that too, that, you were rescuing your own marriage. Do you want to kind of talk a little bit more about that too?
Yes. My personal experience and the experience I keep seeing with my clients over and over again, and it's not across the board 100%. This isn't everybody, but generally the women feel the pain more than the men do. And we are just a little clueless, and it's sad, but it's true. And wives will complain, and then we call it nagging, right? They just kind of nag. But what they're nagging about is certain needs that aren't being met. And women have a tendency to, generally, not always, but women lots of times have the tendency to sacrifice what they feel like they need in order to give others what they need. My wife did it for me, and it made her unhappy, and she did it for the children. And I see a lot of women do that that I work with, that they'll just, especially their own needs for their husbands and for everybody else, right? They're going to make sure everyone else's needs are met, but they're going to forego their needs. And so they get more and more unhappy. They feel more and more empty. They feel more and more not fulfilled and not rejuvenated. And they just feel worse and worse. And as they start feeling those feelings more and more, their resentment goes up. And they feel more and more resentful towards their spouse. So Audrey did a good job of meeting my needs. And these are marital needs I'm talking about. They're not individual. The individual needs this is one of the principles, meet your individual needs. That's like exercising and praying and taking care of your mind and taking care of your social. That only you can do that, right? But these marital needs are different. And this is where your spouse has to meet these marital needs. And Audrey did a pretty dang good job of meeting those needs. So when I say our marriage was terrible, on me, if you were to scale it probably a 1 to 10, I think probably 10 being blissful, super happy marriage, 1 being horrible, I'd probably say a 6. And I used to say 5, but the more I think about it, it's probably a 6. It just wasn't ever really that bad for me. I mean, if she just would stop nagging, then things would have been fine, right? But for her, she would have rated it a 1.
Wow.
She felt so unfulfilled. She felt so empty and like I didn't love her. Matter of fact, we got in a big fight one time, and she slapped me across the face. And that was kind of a benchmark in our marriage. And she'd never done it since and never done it before. And so I don't see her ever hit anybody, but she did me. But the look of resentment was just, oh my gosh, we're in trouble. I'm in serious trouble here. So I got on my knees the next morning and said a prayer, and it was a long time ago. It was when we had Yellow Pages. So I opened the Yellow Pages and called a marriage counselor, and just scheduled an appointment. And my wife says, I told her I got an appointment with a counselor. She says, you do? She felt so terrible inside that she didn't think I loved her anymore. And the fact that I would go to a counselor, and I would pay the money, and I would go every week, she was surprised. She's like, oh, he does love me. He does want this to work out. I wasn't trying to be a jerk. I really wasn't. I just didn't know what I wasn't doing.
Yeah. And you probably
that's why it was so painful for her.
Yeah, like you were doing, you maybe thought that you were doing all that you could do, and didn't understand maybe. Was that?
Well, yeah, especially I didn't understand these needs. I've discovered those since. But yeah, definitely I didn't understand those things. But there are things I did know that I didn't do, and I thought it's not a big deal. But it was a big deal to her. I mean, she would ask me for years, why don't you help me with bedtime? And I was like, why? I mean, it's just go down and put the kids to bed. And finally I said, fine, I'll help. This was after a long time, and I'll go help. She keeps nagging about this, nagging in quote, right? Quote, because when we do those things they're quote unquote nagging about, all of a sudden they disappear. They don't nag about it. They don't complain about it because we've done it. So I go down and help it. She'd come with me. And I was like, why are we doing this together? This is such a waste of time. So I kind of quit doing it. And then she started complaining again about it. And I used to realize she just wanted me there. She just wanted to feel my support.
Yeah.
And so even though I thought it was a waste of time, it wasn't. It was super important to her.
Yeah, it is a time the bedtime thing can end up being a really, it can help a lot of relationships in that regard. That's awesome. Let's talk about, I love how you talked about, that you had everything that we really have a passion for. Sometimes we protect it and we don't want to mess it up or, kind of move into that. But was it when you started going to a counselor that you thought that you were just going to dive into this and go for it that way? Or what was what changed your mind in that direction?
More or less, we went to the counselor, and the best thing that we got out of the counseling was that Audrey knew I was committed to the marriage. And I hate to knock on my profession, but marriage and family therapists and just marriage counselors in general don't know what they're doing. And I say that because I just went through the whole degree program, and had I not done all my study and research outside of the program, I wouldn't know what I'm doing. And it's not the people in it. I want to be crystal clear on that. It's not the educators. It's not all the people that are becoming, all the professionals that are getting those degrees. They have good hearts. They want to help. But I went to the local university, and I met with the graduate program, and it was an old friend of mine from high school that was there. And he's like, "What are you doing?" I said, "I want my marriage and family therapy degree." He's like, "Well, I have one." I said, "Well, why aren't you practicing?" He's like, "Because I can't stand working with the couples. All they do is fight all the time." And then when I was in my degree program, I had an interview at marriage and family therapist, and I asked him a bunch of questions, but one of them was, "What do you dislike most about your job?" He says, "Working with the couples. All they do is fight all the time." And I was like, "Oh my gosh." And so I hear too, people would say, I was selling real estate to provide, and I got into a model homes where I could study more. So I was sitting in a model, I'd have my textbooks out, and they're like, "What's this for?" And I said, "I'm getting my MFT degree." And they're like, oh, that's good. And I was like, "Well, you don't understand," because I could tell what they were thinking, right? "Oh, that's kind of a joke." And I said, "No, I'm going to do these principles and stuff." And they're like, "Oh, that's awesome." Because when we went, it was a total waste of time, waste of money. And I got that over and over and over again. So it's the model. It's the structure that's set up. It's kind of a broken system. So you got all these great people going into it, but when they come out the other end, they don't really have any tools or skill sets to help marriages than when they started. I mean, I went through a 60-degree program, and Liberty University is incredible. I love Liberty University. They are so awesome. But out of the 60 credit hours, only 2 classes were required on marriage, and they didn't have any other ones that I could take. And in my internship, which was 700 clinical hours, I wasn't required to work with one couple.
Oh, that's interesting. Wow.
And neither are any of the other people. You just have to go through. So and you know how many internships are with couples? Almost none. You might work with some, but it's individual counseling, right? Or it's addiction recovery or whatever it might be. But so often they don't do that. And then I had one class that was on counseling, and we had to practice and role play, and we had to critique each other. And I had another one on group counseling, and we had to lead a group, and we were critiqued, but we were never critiqued on how to work with a couple.
Well, that's interesting. Oh, boy.
Yeah, isn't that funny? So,
yeah.
But they just don't have the answers. So, Dr. Balcom, he studies and researches marital therapeutic approaches, and he's the leading expert in the world on marriage therapy approaches. And at the end of every year, he says the same thing. There still isn't an effective approach to marriage therapy. And he doesn't know about mine yet, but I'm absolutely convinced that these 12 principles, because I've seen what it did to my marriage and to my clients' marriages, that it will be a breakthrough. And I believe he'll say when he sees it that, yes, we finally have one.
Yeah. I'd love to get back to some of those things that you talked about. But what I would like to kind of focus on at this point, though, is that inspiration kind of behind your own practice. In your bio, we talked about how as you gained insight for, marital study, that you found principles in the classics. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
I was fortunate enough to get a liberal arts bachelor's degree, and I started this pursuit of, we started understanding principles. When you read the founding fathers and then the classic literature, I mean, even Bacon and back to Aristotle and Plato, and they talk about first principles all the time. And first principles are, it's like in the Declaration, they're self-evident, right? Mm-hmm. That anyone will know. Everybody knows that you're not supposed to kill somebody. Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
Even the person that kills somebody, it's just self-evident. And everyone knows that if you earn something, if you buy something, if you have property, that no one should take it. Those are very obvious. And so that kind of started educating us on what principles are, that they're foundational laws. But what about these other areas? And so we started, my wife and I would talk, because we both were fortunate to get this education. We would talk about different, well, does it work in finances? And we're like, well, yeah, it does. When you save 10%, when you have an emergency fund, when you don't debt, right? When you live on a budget, when you have more income coming in than going out, things like that, all of a sudden people have financial peace.
Yeah.
And anyone can do it. And it doesn't matter if you lived 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, if you live in modern China or in America today, it doesn't matter. Anyone that lives those principles will get good finances. And then we looked at health and like, oh, that's right. If you eat a really great diet, if you exercise regularly and you exercise correctly, then, and you drink lots of water, different things like that, you're going to have the optimal health that you can have. And so as we discussed it, we're like, one day Audrey turned to me and said, well, Blaine, what are the principles in marriage? And I was like, well, I don't know. But there's got to be. They're in everything else. They're in business, right? They're in auto mechanics, and you name it. There's principles in whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
So what in the world would they be in marriage? And so I sat down and wrote out a list, and then Audrey and I discussed it for 2, 3, 4 days, and actually it was probably several weeks. And finally we honed in on the 12, and I kept going over them. Is this really a principle? Does this apply to everybody, everywhere, all the time? And if it didn't, we'd get rid of it. If it did, then it would stay. And then I said, okay, are there more? And we searched, and we narrowed it down to 12. And I haven't been able to find another one. And I believe all 12 are solid principles. So that's kind of how we did it. But we saw it in the classics too, like Paradise Lost, how he talks about there's a great, I think it's chapter 9 in Paradise Lost about being unified and how Adam and Eve weren't unified. And that's when it broke down. And I mean, that's how Milton does it, right? When Satan comes into the garden and tempts Eve, it's because they had separated and she was going to do the things on her by herself. She was just trying to be more productive, but Adam kept saying, let's stay together. So we saw that in these different classics over the years. And there's lots of them. You look in Pride and Prejudice, and I mean, Jane Austen was awesome in how explaining parental principles, marital principles, and different things like that. And the impact when people didn't live those principles correctly.
I love that insight, because sometimes we have to look at those types of things to help see, the problems, or like you said, to find the principles in how to have better marriages. Let's kind of talk about maybe how your paradigm changed from, your own personal study, or from taking your marital, trying to get the therapy license done, to, studying these classics and finding these own principles. How do you feel like your paradigm has changed over time and with experience?
My paradigm, it used to be, some people will say, they're just lucky, right? They just happen to have a fabulous marriage, right? They didn't even have to
they're
try.
Just both good people.
You're right. You'll hear the one couple out of, 200 million couples, right, that they never fought one time. They're yet to have an argument. They're in their 90s. But for all the rest of us humans, it works a little bit differently. And what happens is, the more I've done this, my paradigm has been, it's not such happenstance. It's actually almost like a conveyor belt. Meaning, I stick people into the conveyor belt, and they go through the 12 principles, and they pop out a happy marriage. It's almost scientific at this point. I'm yet to see a couple live those 12 principles and not have a happy marriage. And every single time that they say this isn't working, I say, okay, well, let's look at it. And we look at the principles, and they're breaking principles every single time. And so my paradigm is just, this is rock solid. God, in all his wisdom, was so kind to give us principles. Now, these principles aren't, I talked about it earlier, first principles. They talk about first principle all the time in the classics. Well, these are secondary principles. They're not so self-evident. We know that we should be trustworthy, right? And we know, and that's obviously one of the principles is build complete trust. And there's other principles like that, but there's some principles like to understand your spouse. We just don't know that. It's just so non-self-evident that we don't know it. And so the real paradigm change I've had is when people live the principles, they get the results every time. And it's uncanny. I have my clients that have either filed for divorce or had filed for divorce, or were thinking about that and have canceled the divorce, and they're getting happier and happier and happier to the level that they live the principles.
Yeah. Let's kind of talk about, we spoke before you fully answered this question about how, sometimes we feel like, oh, those people are just lucky or something like that. Let's talk about maybe some challenges that you've had along the way. You talked about couples that fought a lot, what were some challenges that you had, and what did you learn from those as you were going through this process?
My own personal challenges or develop, with my marriage
Well, you can talk about both because sometimes, as we're working through our personal challenges, it helps us in, especially in your case with your marriage therapy, how did those work together, or as even if you're trying to develop these 12 principles?
Well, when I say it's scientific, you get in and you go through the 12 principles and pops out a happy marriage. The problem with that is someone starts going through the conveyor belt and then they jump through the wall and say, this isn't working. I don't believe it. That's the hardest part, is actually believing that they will work. I know people that really struggle with their weight and they're just like, it doesn't matter what I do, it just won't work. And if we got down and, I don't do that, but if I did get with someone and say, okay, well, let's examine the principles and let's see how well you're living them, they wouldn't be living the principles.
Yeah.
But they have such little faith that they give up before they try. They might work out for a week, but then they stop. I haven't lost any weight. It's not working. And so that's by far the most difficult thing to do, is to get people to trust me and to believe it. I didn't trust myself. My wife would say those things. I need you to do this for me. I need you to do this. And I was like, okay. And I started doing it. I'm like, well, things haven't, she's still kind of complaining or whatever. And I don't see a big difference. And so I would stop doing them. I just didn't believe it.
Yeah.
And I've had client after client say, well, no. And then eventually, it's so fun when they get it. Oh, my heck, it's a blast. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to do this. And they go out on faith and they trust me and they do it. And all of a sudden there's impact on their marriage. And they're like, oh, my gosh, it's working, Blaine. Yep, it's working. You just have to work it. So that by far is the biggest struggle, I think.
Getting people to trust it. Yeah. Well, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have Blaine on from the beginning is that, I definitely believe that all marriages can, no matter how happy they are, can definitely use a tune-up. We can definitely learn some things and always be improving. That's the great thing about marriage, is that no matter how bad it is, that we can always make it better. So let's kind of talk a little bit more about, tell us about those 12 principles in marriages, maybe what they are.
Okay, be happy to. And we actually created a course, an online course that people can do, because most people that have a good marriage, there's a couple things that are really bugging them, but overall they wouldn't trade it for anything. They have a great, fairly good marriage. Well, they're never going to go into marriage counseling. And matter of fact, if they did, the statistics are 82% aren't going to improve. But they're not going to do that. So that's part of the reason I created the course, is so I can help people help themselves whenever they want it. If they had minimal things to do, well, it doesn't cost that much money, and they could go ahead and fix their marriage. So they have those tools. And then all these 12 principles is what we teach in the course. But the first one is put your marriage first. And I think that's pretty self-evident or obvious. I actually have an assessment that people can go to my site and take. And in that assessment, it will grade them on the 12 principles and how they're doing. And they get kicked back an email in a few minutes, and it just grades them. And so they can be crystal clear on how they're doing on these principles. But put your marriage first. I think one of the questions in the assessment is, how often did you discuss with your spouse about your marriage? Some people say, I haven't talked to him for years. That's not putting your marriage first, obviously. Number 2 is ensuring individual needs are met. I think we mentioned that. Making sure you've met your physical and your spiritual and your emotional and your mental needs. 3, and if you have any questions we go through, just jump in. 3 is regularly forgive and repent. And sometimes it's very hardest to forgive the person we sleep with.
Yeah.
Because if they love me, right, why would they do this over and over again?
Definitely.
And when Christ said, you got to forgive them 7 times 70, I think he was talking about husbands and wives. That's a joke, but it's probably true. Anyways, 4 is safeguard against addiction and abuse. And just so you know, I'm a recovered pornography addict. And once I found the principles of addiction recovery, I've been clean. And I know, and I'm empowered because I know what to do now. I know what causes addiction. So people go to my site and they're struggling with that, them or someone they know, I have free addiction recovery. And that's so I can continue to live principle number 12 of addiction recovery.
Before we go on, let's listen to this message.
Hey, fire starters, are you looking for a new way to listen to the Luminous Mind? Try listening on Stitcher. Haven't heard of Stitcher? Think of it as radio on demand. You can listen to the Luminous Mind anytime, anywhere. There is no downloading, no syncing, no wasted memory. Just stream your favorite podcasts such as The Luminous Mind. Stitcher is available on iOS, Android, Nook, iPad, and also from your favorite internet browser. Don't have Stitcher? Download it free today at Stitcher.com or in the App Store. And make sure you rate and review The Luminous Mind so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.
Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Blaine Rindlisbacher, who's helping to make marriages happier. Well, an addiction recovery or addictions can be pretty much anything, right? I mean, that could be food, that could be, anything that you put above your marriage, like social media. You know, you always see the commercials of the couples in bed, playing with their phones instead of talking, or it's something else. Is that correct?
You're right. You're spot on. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's unhealthy, if it's interfering with your daily activities and it's interfering with your relationships, then you can't stop. That's the goal. Some people, I've talked to a lot of people over the years, and they say, "Well, I'm not an addict." I said, "Well, then stop. Don't do it again. It's not healthy." Especially like pornography. That's obvious, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you're drinking or whatever. But if they can't stop, then they definitely have the addiction. And it's very easy to get to there's four main causes, and we don't have time going into that, but very easy to do. I mean, it's difficult, don't get me wrong. I guess the word is simple, and it's worth it. The hard work to overcome it, the pain doesn't last that long, and then you're free of your addiction.
Yeah.
So,
and you're happier too. So anyway, go ahead.
Oh yeah. And marriage gets a lot better when it's not there, way better. So, 5, frequently express love and make sacrifices for your spouse. That's the one that the men have the most trouble with, in my experience. 6, respect and appreciate your differences. Both spouses have major problems with that. Not always, but I see that a lot.
Well, and sometimes you grow, as you get older, you grow and you change. And sometimes it's hard to accept somebody like, oh, they've changed, they're now into something different, or, you know what I mean? Like, as you grow older, your interests change. And so sometimes that's hard for a spouse. It's like, well, you didn't ever used to do this before. Why are you doing it now? Type of thing. That's
actually the next principle. The respect and appreciate your differences would be more like gender differences. It would be more like, well, the kind of 6 and 7 principles kind of tie into each other quite a bit. So your spouse might be an extrovert and you might be an introvert. And I see spouses resent their spouses because they aren't the way they are. But there's a lot of things that an introvert can learn from an extrovert and vice versa.
Yeah, definitely.
So 7 is truly understand your spouse and yourself. This is completely 100. I mean, the 12 principles is unique to adore your spouse, but this specific principle, I've never even heard it discussed in the therapy world. They don't even know what I'm talking about. And it is so empowering to get to know your spouse. And when you talked about when people develop new hobbies and new things over the years, that's part of it. But it goes much deeper in that. For example, Audrey and I used to go, well, we've always gone places together, but there'd be times when we'd go to a new building or something. And there was one building we went in, and it was we were doing a spiritual thing. We were worshiping, and I was sitting next to her, and we were there just kind of talking, or we were quiet, and I think I can't remember what happened. Someone was talking or whatever. And after about 20 minutes, I turned to her and I said, "Hey, Audrey, I think that door goes over there. And I think it goes into this other part of the building." And she's like, "What are you talking about? We're supposed to be having this spiritual experience, and you're talking about the floor plan?" But what we eventually figured out is that I'm spatially intelligent. And so now she just thinks it's funny. But before she would kind of resent me, because why would I be thinking about it? The reason I thought that is because I'm wired that way. I just have to kind of know which way is north. And I always do most of the time. And so and now we use it to our advantage. Whenever we have to organize the storage room or the garage, or we have to pack for a trip, I'm the one that does it because I can do Tetris with my eyes closed, And so those are the kind of things we're talking about when we say truly understand your spouse and yourself. Principle 8 is build and preserve complete trust. 9 is engage in kind and effective communication. And that is the Ichni. That is the principle in the counseling world. Communication, communication, communication. And when we went to our marriage counselor, that's what she taught us, communication techniques. Now, they were good, and they were valuable. As a matter of fact, I even teach some of those things that she taught me, but it's only one of the 12 principles. I mean, you can have incredible communication, but if you don't respect your differences, you see what I'm saying? Or if you don't have any trust, how's your marriage going to thrive? It's not. You're going to have good communication, but you're going to be frustrated in these other areas.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, you can tell somebody, well, I'm going to go do this, but I mean, it's still pulling away from that marriage type of thing.
Exactly. Principle 10, maintain healthy boundaries. That's women have the biggest problem with this one by far out of all 12.
With children
I'd say overnight.
And in-laws, or what do you say?
No, with their husbands.
Oh, okay.
So by far, I think.
Talk a little bit more about that. I mean, what does healthy boundaries? What do you mean by that?
Well, whenever your spouse does something that makes you feel really uncomfortable or that goes against common sense, when they're breaking the law, when they're breaking a principle. So the husband wants this boat, right? And you know he loves the water ski. And matter of fact, he deserves to have a boat if anyone does, because on New Year's Day, he goes and breaks the ice in the lake and he does water skiing. I mean, if anyone should have a boat, it should be that kind of guy, right? But now he wants this new boat, and it's only going to be $35,000 of debt at 23% interest rate. Well, that's breaking a financial principle.
Yeah.
So for him to push and push until his wife caves in on that, and for her to, but see, if the wife would say, no way, man, we are not getting a debt that's breaking a principle. If you want to earn the cash and we go buy it, that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that, when the wife puts her foot down, or sometimes the husband has to, when you put your foot down and say that's not going to happen, and you can do it very nicely. I'm not saying that. And most people can't, if they have a problem with this, we have to build them up. We have to strengthen the individual. They just can't do it. It's obvious what to do. I had one person I was coaching, and she said that her husband would come home from work and game every night, and he would game from 5:30 to 1:30 every day.
Wow.
And I said, what did he say when you told him you didn't like it? She says, I've never told him. I said, how long has he been doing it? Oh, he's been doing it for a couple of years at least. So see the problem there? She just, first of all, you just say, please don't do that. And then you need to go on more and more. And you can do it without, you can't, we don't have obviously nearly enough time to get into this and teach it thoroughly, but it has to be based on natural consequences. You can't put your husband in timeout, right? He's not two. So you have to do something else, and then you have to, whatever consequences that you're going to enforce have to be actions that you take. You can't make him do anything.
Yeah. Well, and I think this goes really well with the addiction thing too. Sometimes as spouses, we let them just carry on with without that addiction. We don't want to step in and. Yeah.
But as a recovered addict, I wanted to stop. I prayed. I wanted to stop. I did all kinds of things. I didn't know how to stop.
Wow.
And so I understand that there's a dynamic there. And once you learn the 12 principles of addiction recovery, this happens to be 12 there too, but once someone learns those and they apply them and they'll submit, that's the biggest key. They'll submit and actually do them, then they'll be freed.
Yeah.
So these natural consequences that generally the wives have to put in place, they have to do it so where they have to take action, right? And punishment has to fit the crime. You can't say, okay, well, you didn't say, you said you were going to fix the vacuuming, you didn't do it, so I'm not going to sleep with you for 6 months. It has to be related. It has to be tight. And like I said, there's not nearly enough time. But the point is, when women do this boundary, not only do they feel better, because the second they let the husband do something that they don't want to do, they resent their husband.
Yeah.
Over on this assessment, I've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people take it. Over 90% of people have resentment in their marriage. It's an absolute cancer and will destroy a marriage. And that's why we go back to forgiveness and repentance, right? When I said that's, the hardest to forgive is the person you sleep with, because if they break any of the principles, you have that. So it can be a major problem. But when the wife does put their foot down, she doesn't resent her spouse, and the marriage gets better, but the individual gets better too. Because the husband knows he shouldn't buy a $35,000 boat at 23% interest rate, right? He knows he shouldn't. He just wants to. He knows he shouldn't game every night, and that he's ignoring his family and his familial responsibilities. And so he's a better man because wife said, no, don't do that. And actually, I was reading Christy. I don't know if you've read that book. It's incredible, by Catherine Marshall.
Actually,
but there's a little discussion in there. She talks about, she says, every woman has to put their man in place. Was it Christy? Now I'm thinking it might have been another. Anyway, so that's another classic where I would see marital principles come out. Let me finish these. Number 11 is clarify roles and fulfill responsibilities. That is super, super important. And the last is create unity in all areas of the marriage.
And do you want to kind of maybe give us some areas that you feel like you see couples struggle with the most? Male, female struggles? You named a couple, but...
The biggest turning point was post-slap for me. When I say post-slap, that's after, years after Audrey had slapped me. I was moving to Texas. I had a long drive. I had the moving van. And I was driving, and I thought, okay, what can I listen to? And I thought, I just went to the library, and they had Men Are From Mars, Women From Venus. So I said, I'll do this. This would be awesome. So I was always reading relationship books. And I listened to the whole thing, and he says in there, you need to talk to your wife, and you need to listen to her. And when she starts talking to you, she's going to open up, and you'll feel like she's attacking you, but she's not attacking you. And I said, okay, that's fine. And he says, the more you don't get defensive, the more you'll feel like she's attacking, but she's not. She just wants to be understood. And I said, okay, great. And then he says, so when she's talking to you, make sure that you don't get defensive. I mean, he just kind of hammered on it, right? Don't get defensive, don't get defensive. And then you have to reply to her. You have to let her know that you're listening. And so when she's talking, you need to say, okay, honey, yeah, I understand. Uh-huh. Yeah, okay. And I thought, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. How did he sell one book, let alone 20 million, right? This is ridiculous. So I get home, and finally from the trip, I get home really late. We wake up in the morning, and I go downstairs, and Audrey's sitting on the couch crying. And I thought, heck, this is a great opportunity. I'll try this out. So I start talking to Audrey, and she starts attacking me. And I was like, what in the world did I do wrong? And I thought, okay, but don't get defensive. And so she kept going, and she kept attacking me more and more. And I was like, don't get defensive. Don't get defensive. I kept that mantra going, don't get defensive. And then after a while, I thought, oh, no, what am I supposed to be doing? I was like, oh, that's right. I said, honey, I understand. And it sounds funny, but the guy nailed it, because I felt so attacked that I had to keep telling myself, don't get defensive, don't get defensive, don't get defensive. And then I had to acknowledge what she was saying, so she felt like I was listening to her. Anyway, that was the first time I ever really heard my wife. And it wasn't that day. It was the next 30 days. Every night we'd lay in bed, I'd hold her in my arms, and she'd bawl. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, I thought, she married the devil. I am the devil incarnate. There's not a worse, scummier man on the earth. And all she was doing, she the first time in her life, in our married life, she felt safe that she could talk to me.
Wow. That
I wasn't going to get mad, because I always got mad. When they get defensive, right, men get mad, because I felt like she's talking about the finances, and I'm saying, what am I thinking? Well, that's my fault, right? Or she's talking about, I want to do this with the kids, and I don't feel like we're doing this. Well, that's my fault. And so I would take it upon me. I'm the guilty one, and she just wants to be heard.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the number one thing I would tell men is, so often they don't know what's going on with their wives. They don't understand the pain they're in. And so that would be my number one advice, is just to really hear your wife.
A lot of times when a wife is saying those things, they're almost attacking themselves. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can understand, like, well, I want to do this with the kids and it's not getting done. I feel just as much responsibility. I mean, even though you're telling your husband, you feel the responsibility as well, right? And so, but if he gets defensive, then that makes you feel even worse.
Right, and it shuts down the conversation, right, immediately. Yeah. But the man's there thinking, well, the only reason she's bringing this up is because I've created the problem, and that's not it at all. She just wants to be understood. She wants to say, I'm struggling with this, and I need someone to hear me, and that's why I'd go on those listing presentations, and those women would start bawling, because I would hear them. I would say, this is hard, or, I know this can be really tough, or whatever. And she'd be like, oh my heck, he heard me. Someone heard me. And she'd start crying. Yeah.
It might have been the first time for a while, right?
Yeah. So to answer your question with the women, the most important thing I could see women that they need to do is meet their individual needs. They need to exercise at least 5 days a week, for at least 30 minutes a day. They got to get their heart rates up. They got to sweat. They got to get those endorphins kicking in so they feel rejuvenated. They've got to pray. They've got to be close to their maker. They've got to read their scriptures. They need to go on social outings. If they're introverted, they need to go on social outings that they don't have a lot of people, that rejuvenate them. Maybe it's going in the mountains. Maybe it's going on walks. Maybe it's, I don't know what it is. Whatever it is, they need to do that. If they're the life of the party extrovert, then they need to get around people, and they need to make sure that's part of their regular routine. One woman I was working with, she joined a biking club, and she went and bought a bike and a helmet and the pads and everything, and she loved it, and she was having a blast. And her story is absolutely remarkable after she started meeting her needs, what she was able to do with her marriage. But, and they need to meet their mental needs. God gave us a mind for a reason. He expects us to use it. And we think, well, I'm not in school, so I don't have anything to do. What am I going to do mental? I used to think that when I had a Franklin Covey planner, and it would say every week you had to set your goals, and every week it would say mental goals. I was like, what in the world would I set for a mental goal? I had no idea.
Yeah.
Maybe I could read a book, but the point is, those have to be met, and women ignore their needs because the other needs are more. I'll just put it off. And they can't do that. They're less effective than they would be. They're more grouchy. They're irritable. They feel terrible, and then they allow people to walk on them, and then the resentment rises.
Well, they feel like the martyr, and then exactly.
Yeah, and they are being the martyr, right? They're sacrificing their health, their mental, social, spiritual, physical health, for everybody else, and no one seems to give a darn because it doesn't matter how much they give, right? It's not enough.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Blaine and I were talking about before how we would definitely want to have him back with his wife to talk a little bit more about, marriages and these 12 principles. But maybe before we say goodbye, do you have any final parting words for our listeners? And then give us your contact information, hopefully that way people can go on, take your test, and kind of really dive deep into these principles.
Well, like I mentioned, I have the online course, and you've said it a couple of times that any marriage needs fine-tuning, right? And the reason that is because life hits us at different stages, right?
Yeah.
When we're 25, we're going through stuff, but we don't know the big crisis coming up when we're 33. And when it hits us, how are we going to react? When you have these 12 principles, then you're empowered because you have the tools. So it doesn't matter what hits you, you have the tools to handle your marriage and keep your marriage good. My wife and our marriage is awesome. It's not perfect. We still argue now and again, but we have the tools to repair it immediately and to keep it really healthy and happy.
I would think that almost any marriage is struggling in at least one principle. Would you not agree with that? Or
no, because of my assessment, I've had a few people take it and they had straight A's all the way across. Fabulous marriage. And my wife and our marriage, I would say probably straight across. Every once in a while we have one, but it's just because can you work out? Can you work out regularly? Can you eat a healthy diet? Can you drink lots of water? Can you get enough sleep? You can do those things. You can have optimal health, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe one day you decide not to eat healthy. Well, it's going to start affecting it, right? And if you do that for a long period of time, it will really affect your health.
Yeah. Definitely.
Or maybe you decide not to work out. It's the same with these. Are you going to live the principles, all of them? And if you do, then great. And if you decide to back off on some of them and not do it, then your marriage is going to start getting hurt.
Yeah, definitely.
So I believe you can get to the 12. I believe you can live all of them, and you can have a very, very happy marriage. Anyone can.
Great.
Can I say one last thing in closing?
Sure, definitely.
The question you asked me is the one thing I would encourage anybody to do. I know I mentioned my course, and I think it's extremely valuable. But if you don't want to do that, that's fine. Whatever you want to do, but do something. Do something to help your marriage. There's books. A lot of them are on communication, but there are other books. We got a lot of free stuff on our site. Just do something to make your marriage better, because marriage holds our society together, right? Our children are more likely to get married when we have happier marriage. It's so critical, not just so we have happiness in our own lives, but our children see our examples. And do they want to get married? Or do they, because some people stay together and the children grow up and say, well, I'm never going to get married. My parents were absolutely miserable. Yeah. So we want that. And then when the marriages stay together, society is stronger. Society is healthier. Society is better. So please do something to help your marriage, whatever that is. Read, study. There's tons of things you can look on YouTube, and just make sure that whatever you're studying and whatever you're doing is principle-based, so you can actually get the results you want.
Awesome. Thank you. That was great. And do you have contact information? How can our listeners get in touch with these 12 principles?
If they go to adoreyourspouse.com, then you just click on the Contact Us button at the bottom. And if they need to send me an email, I'm happy to reply. Or they can take the assessment and find out more. We also have a blog on our front page that we give free marital tips on a weekly basis. It's the video. I guess it's called a vlog, where we have a short 5-minute video every week. Audrey and I do it together. and we just give some marital advice and tips that will help your marriage. And we always have a challenge in there that you can do to get your marriage a little bit better.
Well, and I hope we can get you back on and, like I said, with Audrey and have this class kind of, because I just feel like it's so important. And there are some great resources on his website. Like you said, that's a free assessment that you can go and take. And again, his website is adoreyourspouse.com. But we're going to be sure to link all that information that we've discussed today on our website as well. But thank you so much, Blaine, for joining us and helping to light our minds on fire. I so appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Blaine and Adore Your Spouse, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list. Then check out our services tab to see how we can continue to assist you, our fire starters. Also, to help us continue production of illuminating content, go to the sponsor tab at theluminousmind.net for more information on sponsorship and affiliate programs. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and now Instagram. Get our free audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider these easy ways. Tell your friends about us. Leave us a review. Share our content. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.